She looked barely 25. Her dress hung in tatters, her skin covered in purple and red marks no one should ever bear. Dust clung to her face, lips cracked from thirst, and her body lay twisted in the Mojave sand, half hidden beneath dry palm leaves tossed there like trash. Most travelers would have ridden on, figuring she was another lost soul claimed by the desert. But when James Carter pushed those fronds aside, he saw she was still alive, just barely. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded and distant. A whisper escaped her lips, so faint he almost mistook it for wind. "Bury me here. Not save me. Not help me. Just bury me here." If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. The words hit James harder than any bullet ever had. He froze, staring at this broken young woman, and in that moment the ghosts of his past pressed close. He had buried too many before, in battle, in silence, innocent and guilty alike. Imagine standing in his boots. A man who'd already laid a wife in the ground, who'd watched his only daughter ride away to another state, who spent each day alone on a ranch beneath a sun that didn't care if he lived or died. Now picture stumbling on a young woman whose family had been destroyed by men like he once rode with. Her voice asking not for mercy, but for a grave. Would you walk away? Or would you kneel there, hands shaking, knowing that saving her might mean facing sins you swore you'd never speak of? James's chest ached as he looked at her. The dust on his own skin felt lighter than the weight of that whisper. He could walk away and no one would fault him. The desert was full of the forgotten, but something in him wouldn't let her join them. Maybe it was his daughter Emily's face he saw in hers. Maybe it was God offering him one last chance to do something right. He bent low, lifted her carefully, feeling the frailty of her body against his arms. With every step back toward his horse, James knew this wasn't just chance. He wasn't carrying only a half-dead stranger. He was carrying the truth of a past he thought he'd buried for good. By the time he reached his small ranch outside Tucson, the sun was sinking behind the desert hills, throwing long shadows across the dirt yard. The place was plain, weathered cabin, a couple of barns, nothing more. He laid her on an old cot inside, gave her water from a tin cup, and watched faint color creep back into her cheeks. Her name, she whispered, was Sarah Dawson. Even her own name sounded beaten thin. Between shallow breaths and careful sips of water, she told him pieces of her life. She'd grown up far from there in a small settlement burned to the ground when she was a child. Her parents were gone in a single night. Since then, she'd been passed from one cruel hand to another until finally sold into a house in Tombstone. She laughed once, bitter and hollow. Not a house, a cage. Men came there to buy what was left of me. James sat in the corner, hat twisting in his hands, each word from her mouth striking him like hammer blows. He knew stories like hers. He had made stories like hers. Years ago, in the war, he rode with men who torched villages and left women and children in ashes. He told himself it was orders, it was survival, just the way war worked. But now here sat a girl whose life had been scorched by the fire they lit. Sarah didn't know. Not yet. She only saw an older man giving her water and a roof, someone who didn't raise a hand against her. She even managed a small smile through cracked lips, a smile that cut James deeper than her bruises, because he knew something she didn't. The blood in her story might be the same blood on his own hands. What happens when a man who saved you turns out to be the same man who once helped destroy you? That question alone kept James awake long after she closed her eyes. The first night passed slow, with only the sound of wind scratching at the cabin walls. James sat near the cot, dozing in and out, every creak of the floor waking him. Once, Sarah stirred and tried to speak, but her voice cracked to silence. He held the cup to her lips, his hand steady, though his heart wasn't. By morning, some strength had returned to her. She asked where she was, eyes wide as she took in the rough-hewn cabin, the single chair, the empty hearth. "Just my place," James said softly. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the sun off you." She tried to sit up, wincing at the bruises hidden beneath her torn dress. James turned his face away out of respect, but also out of shame. He fetched an old shirt from the trunk, one his daughter had left behind years ago, and laid it beside her cot. "It's clean," he muttered, not knowing what else to say. By late afternoon, Sarah's voice grew a little stronger. She spoke in fragments, about the night her home burned, about men who laughed while fire ate through the walls, about running barefoot through smoke so thick it scraped her lungs raw. James listened without a word, staring at the floor, the memories pressing in like heat. When she finished, silence hung heavy in the room. She looked at him, then really looked, as if trying to measure what kind of man he was. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. James didn't answer right away. He thought of Emily, of his wife Mary, of the faces he'd buried in war and the faces he'd rather forget. "No one deserves to be left in the dirt," he finally said. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. 2 days later, Sarah could walk again, though her steps were slow. She stood by the door, holding a cup of water, when the sound of hoofbeats rolled in from the desert. James stepped onto the porch, hand near the old colt that hung beside the door. The rider slowed to a stop, dust curling around his boots. It was Roy Simmons, a man everyone in Tombstone knew. Tall, sharp-eyed, and proud of never earning an honest dollar. He swung off his horse, spit into the dirt, and grinned like a wolf. "Where's she, old man?" Roy's voice was slow, lazy, carrying that ugly sort of confidence men like him wear like a badge. James didn't speak. He just looked at him from under the brim of his hat. The silence was heavier than any threat. Roy shifted, not used to men who didn't look away. Finally, James said in a low, even voice, "She's not yours anymore. Turn around." Roy chuckled, but it rang thin. "You think you can keep her? She belongs back where she came from." James stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the dust. His hand hovered close to the colt, not drawing, not yet. He didn't need to. The set of his shoulders said more than a gun ever could. He wasn't letting this man touch her again. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the barn door. Roy's grin faded. He saw something cold and steady in James's eyes, something that said this wasn't a fight he'd win today. With a muttered curse, he swung back into the saddle. "This ain't over," he spat, jerking the reins hard. His horse kicked up dust as he rode off toward Tombstone. Inside, Sarah had heard every word. She gripped the blanket tight, eyes wide. No one had ever stood up for her before, not once. The fading sound of hoofbeats felt like the first time the world had given her a little room to breathe. James closed the door, sat heavily in his chair, and stared at the floorboards. He knew men like Roy. They never backed off. They gathered friends, nursed grudges, and came back harder. Trouble wasn't gone. It was just waiting. A week passed, though the air around the ranch felt tight, like a storm waiting on the horizon. Sarah was healing fast, color creeping back in her cheeks, but James carried himself heavier than before. He'd spend hours on the porch staring at the hills, as if expecting riders to come out of the dusk. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the ground in long red light, James smelled smoke. He ran out, heart hammering, and saw flames crawling up the side of his hay barn. Sparks flew high, carried by the hot wind. 3 riders galloped away in the distance, their laughter faint but sharp enough to cut through the evening air. James snatched his Colt from the wall, but lowered it again. Firing into the dark would do nothing but waste bullets. Instead, he grabbed a shovel, beating at the fire with all the strength in his arms. Sarah stumbled out of the cabin, coughing from the smoke, hauling buckets of water with shaking hands. They fought the blaze side by side, but by the time it died down, half the barn was gone. The air smelled of ash, and James's arms trembled from the effort. He sat on the porch afterward, black with soot, staring at the barn's broken frame. It wasn't just lumber that burned. That barn had stood since he first settled here, built with his wife's father's help, full of years and memories. Losing it felt like losing another piece of the life he once had. The next morning, the sound of hooves came again, but slower this time, steady and measured. It was Henry Callahan, the town marshal, his gray beard catching the light, badge pinned firm to his vest. Henry had been James's brother in arms during the war. They'd shared foxholes, gunfire, and too many graves. James told him what happened. Henry listened, jaw tight, then shook his head. "These men won't stop, Jim. Not unless someone with weight makes them." Later that day, Henry rode into Tombstone and found Roy Simmons and his crew in the saloon. The air inside was thick with smoke and whiskey, the kind of place where lawmen only walked if they had teeth. Henry's voice cut through the room like a whip. "You boys lit fire to a man's barn. That's blood in the dirt. If you want to stay breathing in this county, you're done chasing that girl." Roy tried to grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. He knew Henry Callahan's kind of weight. Lawmen and outlaws alike listened when he spoke. A word from him could turn the whole town against you. One by one, Roy's men drifted out, drinks unfinished. Roy scowled, but said nothing, boots dragging as he followed them into the sun. Back at the ranch, James told Sarah what Henry had done. She was safe, at least for now, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. She knew men like Roy didn't simply give up. They just waited for the next chance. That night, while the desert cooled and the crickets started up their lonely song, Sarah sat by the fire staring at the flames. "You didn't have to stand up for me," she said softly. James looked at her, tired eyes catching the firelight. Didn't feel like there was any other choice. Sarah smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Most folks would have walked away. James didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, knowing the real fight wasn't over. Not with Roy Simmons, and not with the truth buried in his own chest. The fire in the barn had gone out, but the smell of smoke lingered for days, clinging to the walls, to their clothes, to James's thoughts. He kept replaying it. Those riders disappearing into the night, Sarah coughing as she hauled water, the flames chewing through years of sweat and memory. You could rebuild a barn, sure, but some things once burned never came back the same. Sarah moved carefully around the cabin now, limping less with each sunrise. She swept the porch, washed tin cups in a basin, did small things to pay back a kindness she couldn't name. James would catch her glancing at him sometimes, as if measuring whether he was doing this out of duty or something else. On the third night after the fire, as they sat by the hearth eating beans from a pan, Sarah broke the silence. "You ever lose something you built with your own hands?" James set his fork down, eyes heavy. "More than once," he said. He thought of the barn, of his wife Mary's grave, of the daughter who hadn't written in years. Loss wasn't new to him. It was the one thing that felt certain out here. Sarah nodded as if she understood, though she couldn't know the whole weight of his answer. She stared at the flames, voice low. "That bar meant a lot to you." "It was just wood," James muttered. Then softer, but it had her touch on it. "My wife's father helped raise it." His throat tightened as the words came. Every board was a memory. Sarah didn't reply, but her eyes softened, and that silence felt more like respect than pity. 2 evenings later, Sarah asked about his past. She had grown strong enough now to walk into the yard at sunset, and they stood there together, watching the light die over the hills. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said. "Not much worth telling," James answered, but his voice sounded too flat, too practiced. Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "That true? Or just what you want me to believe?" He looked away, jaw set. A man can only dodge so long before the truth starts walking beside him. One night by the fire, Sarah finally told him everything about the night her childhood ended. She spoke of soldiers riding in at dusk, torches in hand, setting fire to her settlement, burning homes while women screamed and children scattered. She spoke of smoke so thick it choked the stars from the sky. "I still remember their faces," she whispered. Some of them smiled while they lit the fires. James stared at the flames, seeing not just her memory, but his own. Faces from the war. Orders shouted. Villages set alight because someone in command decided it had to be done. He had told himself it was survival. Just another mission. Just following orders. But now, hearing her voice crack, those excuses fell hollow. His chest burned as if the smoke of that night had followed him all these years. He looked at Sarah, her face thin but strong, and for a moment his voice betrayed him. "I was there," he said. The words came out rough, barely above a whisper. "I rode with men who burn out towns. I didn't stop it." The cabin went still. Even the crickets outside seemed to fall quiet. Sarah's hands trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. He couldn't look away. "You," she started, but the words caught in her throat. James nodded slowly, gaze locked on the fire. "I ain't saying I lit the torch, but I didn't put it out either." Her face went pale, but she didn't move, didn't scream, didn't strike him. She just stared, as if trying to decide whether the man sitting across from her was the same one who'd carried her out of the desert or one of the monsters who'd stolen her childhood. Neither of them spoke for a long while. When Sarah finally stood, her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you for telling me," she said. There was no forgiveness in her tone, but no hate either. Just a truth laid bare between them, heavy and raw. That night, James barely slept. He sat on the porch till dawn, staring at the horizon, knowing that some wounds never really close, no matter how much good a man tries to do after. The days after James spoke the truth felt different. Sarah was kind but quiet. She still helped around the cabin, still shared meals by the fire, yet her eyes stayed distant. She was healing on the outside, her bruises fading, her walk steady, but something heavier lived inside her now. James noticed. He didn't press her. He spent his mornings fixing fence lines and checking cattle, his evenings on the porch with his hat pulled low. But every time Sarah walked past, he felt the same question digging at him. Was she looking at him as a man who saved her, or as one of the men who ruined her life? One morning, James woke early to the sound of Sarah packing her things. It didn't take long. She didn't have much, just the shirt he gave her, a few scraps of food, and the little water pouch hanging by the door. "You leaving?" James asked. His voice was calm, but his chest felt tight. Sarah nodded. "You saved me, James. You gave me a place to rest, a chance to live again. But I can't stay." James stared at her, his hands resting on the table. "Because of what I said?" She looked at him, and there was no anger in her eyes, only sadness. "Because some things don't go away. You were honest with me, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I need to find my own road. I can't keep looking at you and seeing that night." James swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was safe here, to ask her to stay anyway. But he also knew she was right. A man can't fix every wrong he's done by holding on to someone who reminds him of it. "You sure you'll be all right out there?" he asked softly. "I've been on my own before," Sarah said, tying the pouch to her saddle. "At least this time, I'm walking away stronger." James nodded, eyes wet though his face stayed steady. "If you ever need help again, you know where to find me." Sarah managed a small smile. "I know." Watching her ride away felt like losing his wife all over again, and his daughter too. Her figure grew smaller against the horizon until the desert swallowed her whole. James stayed standing there long after she was gone, the silence around him louder than any words they could have shared. For the first time in years, though, he also felt lighter, like speaking the truth had burned something out of him, something he'd carried too long. Out here on the frontier, not every story ended with two people under the same roof. Sometimes the truest endings were the hardest ones. That evening, Henry Callahan stopped by the ranch again. The marshal dismounted slow, boots crunching on dry dirt, and looked at the half-burned barn. "Heard she left," Henry said quietly. "Yeah," James replied, sitting on the porch steps. Henry studied his friend for a moment, then said, "You did right by her, Jim. Whether she stays or not, you gave her a chance to breathe." James nodded but didn't answer. His gaze stayed on the empty trail where Sarah had disappeared that morning. Henry sighed. "Roy Simmons won't forget this. Men like him never do. But I think he's smart enough not to test me again. For now, you're clear." James looked up, his voice low. "Trouble always finds a way back, Hank. You know that." The marshal didn't argue. He just laid a hand on James's shoulder before riding off into the fading sun. As darkness settled over the desert, James sat alone with his thoughts. The barn was only half standing. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. But inside his chest, something had shifted. The weight he'd carried for years, the guilt, the silence, had finally been spoken out loud. It didn't erase the past. It didn't bring back the people he'd lost or the ones he'd hurt. But it was a start. The next few days dragged on in a strange kind of quiet. The ranch felt emptier without Sarah moving about, sweeping the porch or humming softly while she cooked. James woke up before sunrise as always, but now there was no second cup of coffee to pour, no voice asking simple questions about cattle or the weather. He didn't realize how much life she had brought into that lonely cabin until it was gone. Every evening, he found himself staring down the trail she had taken, as though expecting to see her riding back. He didn't say it out loud, but part of him wished she would. Not because he thought she could forgive him, but because her presence had eased the ache in his chest. One evening, as the desert sky turned purple and the crickets started singing, James sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. He had been on edge ever since Roy Simmons rode off, spitting threats. Trouble like that didn't just vanish. It hid, it waited. And James had learned long ago that when men like Roy kept quiet, it usually meant they were planning something worse. Henry Callahan came by again, his horse kicking up little clouds of dust as it trotted into the yard. The marshal swung down stiffly, his knees cracking as he hit the ground. He looked tired, older than James remembered, his gray beard catching the last of the light. "Evenin', Jim," Henry said, stepping up onto the porch. "Evenin'," James answered, setting the rifle aside. Henry leaned against the rail. "Any sign of trouble?" "Not yet," James said, "but I can feel it coming." The marshal nodded, eyes narrowing. "I've been hearing talk in town. Roy's laying low, but folks say he's been drinking mean. Men like him get dangerous when they feel slighted." James didn't respond at first. He stared out over the dry pasture, the burned barn standing black against the fading sky. "Let him come," he finally said. "I'm done running from things." Henry studied him for a moment. "That's something to do with the girl?" James gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. She deserved the truth. Deserved better than lies. "Can't say I blame her for leaving." Henry shifted his hat in his hands. "You did right by her. You gave her a chance to live. That's more than most men would have done." James shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I did it for her or for me. Maybe I was just trying to bury my ghosts." Henry's voice softened. "Ghosts don't stay buried out here. You know that better than anyone." The two men stood quiet for a long time, listening to the wind moving through the grass. Finally, Henry pushed off the rail. "You watch yourself, Jim. I'll do what I can to keep Roy off your back, but the law only stretches so far in these parts." After Henry rode off, James stayed on the porch until the stars came out. The desert was calm, but it didn't feel safe. He thought of Sarah somewhere out there, riding alone under the same sky, and hoped she'd find someplace kinder than this. That night, as James tried to sleep, old memories came crawling back. He saw the faces of the villagers he hadn't saved, the flames lighting up the night, the sound of horses pounding through smoke. He thought of Sarah's voice shaking when she spoke of that night, and the look in her eyes when he told her the truth. He woke before dawn, sweat on his brow, heart pounding. As he stepped outside, the morning was still and cool, but something in the air felt wrong. He scanned the horizon, his gut tightening. Men like Roy Simmons never stayed quiet for long. And James knew deep down that when trouble returned, it would test him in ways even Sarah's forgiveness never could. The morning broke hot and sharp. James had barely finished his coffee when the sound of distant hoofbeats carried across the desert. Slow at first, then louder. Not one rider this time, 3, maybe 4. He set the cup down, picked up the Colt from its hook, and walked out onto the porch. Roy Simmons rode in first, his grin stretched thin. 2 men flanked him, both armed, both young enough to think they couldn't die. They pulled up just inside the yard, dust curling around their horses' legs. "Morning, old man," Roy called. "Heard your little stray wandered off. Guess that makes it easier." James didn't answer. He just stepped off the porch, boots crunching on dry dirt, the Colt loose in his hand, but not pointed yet. His stance said enough. Roy swung down from his horse. "I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. You made me look weak in front of folks. Can't have that." James's voice was steady, calm as still water. "You don't need to do this, Roy." Roy smirked. "Oh, I do." He glanced at his men. "Boys." The first shot cracked the air before Roy even gave the signal. James dropped to a knee, fired twice, and one rider fell hard in the dust. The second man pulled his gun, but froze when he saw the barrel of James's Colt steady on him. Roy hesitated too, his bravado slipping for just a moment. "You really want this, Roy?" James asked, voice low. "You won't walk away." The standoff stretched long and tight, the desert holding its breath. Then Henry Callahan's voice rang out from behind them. Drop it, Roy. The marshal had ridden in quiet, rifle resting easy in his hands. One look at him, and the second rider threw his gun down. Roy's smirk cracked. He glanced from James to Henry, then back again, and finally spit into the dirt. "This ain't finished," he muttered, swinging into the saddle. But James saw the truth. Roy wouldn't press it again. Men like him were brave only until the odds turned. They rode off without another word, leaving one of their own bleeding in the dust. Henry dismounted, helping James to his feet. "You all right?" James nodded, though his hand still shook. "I'm fine." The marshal looked at the fallen rider, still breathing but hurt bad. "I'll haul him into town. Maybe a night in jail will teach him more than a grave would." As Henry rode off with the wounded man, James stood alone in the yard. The fight was over. For now, he knew trouble could always return, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way Roy's eyes dropped first. Maybe it was the way James hadn't flinched, hadn't run. That evening, the sun slid low and turned the desert gold. James sat on the porch, the Colt resting on the table beside him, and thought about Sarah. He hoped she'd found a place far from men like Roy Simmons. He hoped she knew he'd kept his promise, that no one would drag her back to that cage again. For the first time in years, James felt something close to peace. Speaking the truth to Sarah had cost him her company, but it had also set him free. Out here in the West, a man's past could chase him until his dying day, but it didn't have to own him. The lesson was simple, though hard-earned. A man isn't only the worst thing he's ever done. Redemption doesn't always come from being forgiven. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground, from protecting what's right even when you're not sure you deserve to. James tipped his hat back, watching the sky fade to stars. The desert night was quiet again, not because danger was gone, but because he'd stopped running from it. And in that stillness, he felt lighter, as if the ghosts he'd carried for so long had finally begun to fade into the horizon. Weeks passed with no sign of Roy Simmons. The desert was quiet again, but James didn't fool himself into thinking life was suddenly safe. Out here, peace was never promised. It was just borrowed time. Still, the ranch began to breathe again. James rebuilt what he could of the barn with his own hands. The work was slow and lonely, but it gave his mind something to hold onto other than memories. Sometimes, as he hammered a beam into place, he caught himself thinking about Sarah. He wondered where she was, if she'd found a town where no one knew her name, if she'd found work that didn't break her spirit, if she'd learned to sleep through the night without fear. He hoped so. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, James spotted a rider on the horizon. For a moment his chest tightened, fearing trouble. But as the figure drew closer, he saw a woman on a chestnut horse. Sarah. She dismounted by the porch, a little thinner from the trail, but standing straighter than when she left. James met her halfway, unsure what to say. "Just passing through," she said with a faint smile. "Good to see you," James replied. "You look stronger." "I am," she said. "I found work up north, with a family that treats me fair. Just thought I'd stop and say thank you." James nodded, the words sticking in his throat. "I'm glad you're safe." They sat on the porch for a while, no need to fill the air with talk. Sarah told him about the town she'd found, about the kind woman who gave her a job, about nights when she could finally sleep without looking over her shoulder. James told her about Roy Simmons backing off and about rebuilding the barn plank by plank. When the stars began to come out, Sarah stood to leave. "I don't know if I'll ever make sense of what you told me," she said softly. "But I know this, you're not that man anymore." James looked at her, his voice low. "I'm trying not to be." She smiled then, a real smile, and it felt like sunlight after a long winter. "Keep trying," she said. He watched her ride away again, but this time the ache in his chest was different. It wasn't the hollow kind that came from loss. It was something steadier, something almost peaceful, like knowing you've done what you could, even if it cost you. That night, sitting under the wide desert sky, James understood something he hadn't before. Redemption didn't come wrapped in applause or tied up with a happy ending. It wasn't about being forgiven by others. It was about choosing every day to be better than you were. He whispered into the quiet, not sure if he was speaking to Sarah, to his wife long gone, or to God himself. A man isn't just the worst thing he's ever done. The stars burned steady above him, cold and clear, but James felt warm for the first time in years. His ghosts were still there, but lighter now, like shadows at dusk. Out here on the frontier, that was as close to peace as a man could ask for. The story ends with this moral. A man can't change the past, but he can choose what kind of man he'll be tomorrow. Redemption is found not in erasing old sins, but in standing for what's right when no one's watching, even if no one ever says thank you.